Stephen Healy is today speaking on the topic of psyche and survival in times of climate breakdown. I'm so glad that Stephen took up our invitation to give the second keynote in Ljubljana. I've had a wonderful time working alongside Stephen and writing alongside Stephen in the past few years, and he is one of the scholars and thinkers in this network who I admire greatly. You'll know his work, of course. He's a co-author of Take Back the Economy. He's written extensively on topics of care, currently working on rethinking waste and working with the circular economy from his institutional base at Western Sydney University. Really looking forward to the talk today. And I'll hand it over to you, Stephen. Just to give you a sense of timing, Stephen's going to speak for about 35 minutes or so, and then we'll have an open Q&A, aiming to wrap up at 1:30 the hour. So that's 9:30 a.m. our time. All right, so I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to Stephen.
Thanks very much. Just bear with me a moment while I share my screen. There is one additional caveat, which is that I've had a cough and a cold that's been quite vicious for the last 3.5 weeks, so I may have a coughing fit. It's possible. Okay, so everybody can see that. Oh. Doesn't seem to be. Okay, there we go. All right. So thanks very much to the Ljubljana conference organizers and the previous speakers and session participants. I've gotten to a few of them, fewer than I would have liked. But one of the chief benefits of belonging to a group like the Community Economies Research Network is the recognition that you're not alone in your thinking and that there are others who share different versions of the same dream. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging, much like Kat did, that I'm speaking to you as an uninvited guest from the unceded lands of the Darug and Guringai peoples, just north of Sydney, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. The context for my reflections are the realities of climate collapse in Sydney and a now years-long effort by members of the Community Economies Research Network and others to imagine, document, and enact ways of responding to climate change in this context. So I've lived in Australia now for 8 years, arriving in a place where acknowledgements to country said by settlers and welcomes to country said by Aboriginal peoples are commonplace in public events and in meetings large and small, a cultural protocol that has been in place so long that they've become rote rather than meaningful. But not always. I can remember 2 welcomes to country that have stayed with me. One was in the spring of 2018, when I and other colleagues from CERN went to an event hosted by the state agency Landcom. Kath and Abby were there amongst others, and Uncle Max, who was at that time a 94-year-old Aboriginal man, did the welcome to country with a full smoking ceremony, and he explained the significance of the smoking. So he was from a generation of people who had been forcibly removed from their lands, and he did not know the country that he came from, but he settled in the Western Sydney suburb of Mount Druitt. I just drove by Mount Druitt on Monday. It's way out west. And he said that he came to care for the country there. He became an active man, Aboriginal man in that context. And then he said to all assembled, and this is multicultural Australia, that it doesn't matter where you've come from, you're here now, and you're welcome to look after country. So that was an invitation to me. A second welcome came a year later in early 2019, when Uncle Greg, one of the campus elders from the Western Sydney University, which means he's from the Barmadigal people of the Darug Nation, came to welcome the participants to the Researching Post-Capitalism course in its first incarnation. I can't remember really if this was second or third run. So there were 20 people in the room, and he asked each of them where they were from. And as the responses came in, Australia, the US, New Zealand, Sweden, he had a story, some kind of connection for each of the places that were mentioned. And as this went on, he also began to tell more and more about himself and where he was from. And it occurred to me that what I was witnessing was someone who had expertise in making kin, that the practice of welcoming the country underway was about forging a relationship, a bond with each person in the room. He also told jokes. He was probably about 20 or 30 years my senior, so he got away with telling jokes that I would not get away with, even though I'm 50 now, still not old enough. But he did end with one joke that I remember, which was about a plane crash full of survivors from a plane crash who were all British football fans. And the fans stumbled upon the remains of a horse. It was sort of beginning to look like a dream. And each of the football fans who were famished elected to eat a portion of the horse that corresponded with their team name. And this worked out pretty well for the team, for the Manchester fan, but the team the fan from Arsenal said that he wasn't hungry. So I'm seeing some laughter, but I realize in Zoom no one can hear you laugh. So in this presentation, I want to share a few thoughts about what it might take well to survive in climate changing times. Surviving well is a term explored in Take Back the Economy as a kind of cross between Marx's concept of necessity and a larger ongoing conversation we're all having right now about well-being. What I want to consider here is how surviving well in climate chaos involves linking changes in material culture to changes in desire, habits of thought and action, and ultimately the development of a new self-conception. So this is an extension of that central insight from post-capitalist politics about how the reciprocal process of changing the world and changing ourselves. But what I'm particularly interested in is how climate change involves us in the experience of loss and how do we attend to loss. But in terms of an orientation, I reckon there's no better starting place than what Uncle Max and Uncle Greg laid out. A commitment to caring for country wherever you are, no matter where you've come from, and expertise in the capacity to make kin. Together, these two things provide the conditions for the possibility of surviving well in times of climate breakdown, a reaffirmation of our not aloneness and the commitment to care, commitment to being with one another. So a few weeks after I heard Uncle Greg's welcome to country, my wife and I adopted our son, who's now 4. And it was at that point that I learned a lot about my capacity to make kin, what love means and what family means. So storytelling, making kin, connecting and relating, these are things that are central to what I understand to be the diverse economies scholarship. Central to community economy is the ethical principle of negotiating the conditions of our interdependence. As Gibson Graham points out, it's not a politics that starts with a presumed community, but one that starts where we are, but also in meeting other people where they're at. This encounter then is singular in expression, and what it means is not presumed in advance. For example, what it might look like to survive well, what the nature of an economy is, or what it is to be together. As if an answer, Lauren Berlant, in her critique of the millenarian formulations of the common, begins to give us a sense of what this entails. They argue that what's powerful about the concept of the commons is how it holds together a world and a sociality that's already broken. It involves the difficult work of convening a world conjointly, although it is inconvenient and hard, and to offer enticements to imagining livable, provisional forms of life, right? So we might say a bit more about that as a different form of enjoyment or pleasure. So I thought I would say a bit about Berlant's formulation as elaborated in their last book on the inconvenience of other people, focusing on a series of what they refer to as formal propositions. So there are 3 of them. 1, inconvenience is the affective sense of the familiar friction of being in relation. It is the pressure that we experience when we interact. 2, we are inescapably in relation to other beings in the world and are continuously adjusting to them. This is a state that's more than being affected but less than being entangled. 3, inconvenience disturbs the vision of yourself you carry around that supports your sovereign fantasy, your fantasy of being in control. And I think this last point is perhaps the most important. Drawing on indigeneity scholars Jody Bird, Michelle Raja, and Jessica Catalino, Berlant argues that sovereignty is not, quote, hardwired into our personality, but is an effect of the ideology of a settler state control. But for Berlant, this, quote, sense of inconvenience of other people is evidence that no one is ever sovereign. Situating ourselves in inconvenient relation to one another, which means making time for them, is linked to the capacity to ask political questions from a non-sovereign perspective, including the question of what it takes to survive well in climate changing time. Recognizing our non-sovereignness, our togetherness provides a different starting point, another basis, for example, for answering Olufemi Otaiwo's question about how to shape a politics of climate reparation, a quote from his most recent book. We spend so much of our time and energy responding to others' mistakes that we lose our ability to distinguish their questions from ours. What forms of social life are compatible with flourishing? What must our economies look like to respond to our social problems? What are the root causes in material and institutional senses from a rigorous perspective of our current problems, and which of them are alterable? How can we build algorithms, institutions, rules, laws, social movements, or revolutions that do the altering? Well, how indeed? Sorry. And this sense of non-sovereignty brings us to Psyche, the Greek goddess of soul. But what I mean by Psyche is something larger, not the individual, something bigger than the subject. Berlant describes themselves at several points as a Lacanian, taking expression in their formal commitment to formalist thinking, a formalism that is abstracted from the particular, but also in relation to this. This is something that shows up in their definition of key conceptualizations. So genre of life, a term that they develop in Cruel Optimism, is an extension of the concept of the imaginary, that sort of moment of coherence. Cruel Optimism, the name for a specific fantasy formation. Sovereignty, then, is like Lacan's early understanding of the I or the ego's imaginary coherence, an illusory projection of completeness ascribed to the other, a reflection, an imaginary rival, or correspondingly, the complete picture of ourselves that we imagine as others see us, a relation Lacan would later describe through the metaphor of alienation, the process of being taken by the signifier. Ultimately, though, this imaginary coherence, this version of our sovereignty, is only part of what comes to be understood as the subject. So Psyche is still bigger, still more. The subject is something positioned and in the context of topological space, where inside becomes outside, in relation to a symbolic order that predates the subject who speaks it and enters into it, and to enter into it is to enter into a loss. An imaginary that's concerned not just with our own imaginary coherence, but the positioning and staging of social coherence, a real that exists at the limits of what is sayable or knowable, what disturbs and disrupts coherence. Psyche then names what both connects and subverts the key distinctions in much of so-called Western thought: individual versus society, mind and body, thought and exteriority, fact and speculation, fantasy and reality. Psyche refers to what goes beyond. As Derrida said to his friend Jean-Luc Nancy in reflecting on Freud's last letter, Psyche is extended under the shade of a walnut tree as the daylight fades. And in the context of psychoanalytic theory, Psyche stretches out to the relational inconvenience of others, repositioning the human in relation to the more than human, the monstrous and the cybernetic, spilling out all over everything, and indeed drawing on many of these fields, cybernetics, linguistics, and so forth, in ways that anticipate a lot of current scholarly preoccupations. So there's been a thought here that's been transpiring for quite a while. So Berlant, again, channeling this formalism, defines infrastructure in terms similar to her propositions about inconvenience and non-sovereignty. Infrastructure, they write, is the living mediation of what provides consistency of the life in the ordinary. Roads, bridges, schools, food chains, finance systems, prisons, families, and districts link the living in an ongoing proximities that are at once material and symbolic. Following this definition, then, psyche is extended, laying out under the walnut tree, but perhaps along the street, past the square, past the bridges, past the mills, past the stacks. Psyche is what coheres. The city where I reside both demonstrates the way in which psyche extends, but also the way that the city can express what Berlant called the deforming fantasy of sovereignty, what took shape alongside the Australian version of the good life. And here, as in other settler societies, the good life is a bundle of promises that find expression in suburban life in the post-war period. We can see this fantasy operating historically. The Cumberland Plan, the most ambitious plan to control and direct Sydney's growth, was conceived in the post-war period and involved segmenting residential, commercial, and industrial districts. A key element of this plan was the use of green belts that would connect existing Crown parklands to act as natural barriers. And so this is a comprehensive vision of what the city of Sydney should look like. But the plan was quickly overwhelmed by objections from property holders that were seeking to realize gains, that wanted to cash in on their holdings and have more suburban development, much like it is now, and also post-war migration from Europe. So population projections for 1980 were actually reached in 1960. And this is what transformed Sydney and all of Australia into a multicultural society. But this ambitious version of the Garden City and the Cumberland Plan gave way to sprawling urban growth throughout the Sydney Basin, finding expression in what Ron Horvath refers to as the machine city space, where the layout and infrastructure primarily exist to connect bedrooms in urban peripheries to jobs that remain mostly in the CBD, or well, a couple of CBDs now. So this explosive growth outwards has pushed the city westward into places that hit 50 degrees centigrade in urban centers during the El Nino vacillation. And it's accelerating. Drawing on census and land use data, colleagues Awais Paracha and Nikki Morrison recently estimated that Sydney lost 60% of its remaining bread bowl in the peri-urban region between 2010 and 2020. This loss of green space and farmland has meant what this has meant during the most recent period of rain, that is to say the last nearly 3 years, has been heightened flooding vulnerability. So all that land that I drove through on Monday had been subjected to torrential flooding. So the scientific consensus is now that human communities, along with everyone else, are unlikely to escape the consequences of climate change. Top of the fold in New York Times this morning. This is a compelling claim, given that they seem to be unfolding in the present. The drought from 2017 to 2019 was so intense that it dramatically increased tree mortality throughout Australia, much more so than the Millennium Drought. 2019 to 2020, there was a landscape fire burning up and down the East Coast. The entire continent was on fire, with a severe strain upon infrastructure, Australia's volunteer firefighters, and the estimated loss of 1 billion animal lives. But what's truly disturbing to me is that these are not images of Australia, but in fact are images of Canada from a year later. And thanks, Heather, for sharing them with me. So the last 3 years in Australia, as in the rest of the world, speak not to a climate collapse to come, but one that's already here, finding practical expression in terms of strains on resources, the built environment, and as well as ongoing financial impacts. They are, to repeat Berlant's phrase, also evidence that no one was ever sovereign. So this is an image of the Sydney Basin generated earlier this year. by the Australian Climate Council of what the risk landscape will look like in Australia, or Sydney, in 2030, in 7 years' time. So the way to read this figure is that it's the cumulated risk categories from all hazards, most notably flooding and fire. And what's astonishing is you look at some of the western suburbs. So Sydney Harbour, you can see in the blue. So I'm talking about that area the size of Tokyo off to the west. Yeah, so what's astonishing is that you look at some of the western suburbs is that the risk profile in 7 years' time will make about 1 in 10 of these properties in Western Sydney uninsurable or severely underinsured in the immediate future. And of course, what that means is that they have no resale value. So 10% of the housing market knocked out as a consequence. So, this may be true, but our literal investment as Sydney-siders in this environment, in this built environment, is not easy to pull back on. In fact, Sydney-siders are doubling down for themselves and future generations on suburbanization as usual. So according to DECRA scholar Julia Cook, in 2010, the average family gift to young first-time home buyers was $20,000. Now in 2020, it's $100,000. And it isn't just middle-class people, but people from new immigrant communities, including those living in public housing, she found, that are looking to give young people a leg up on an unaffordable housing market. So the quick math is that if that gift of $100,000 is matched with $100,000 in savings, that would be 20% on your $1 million home in Blacktown for a 3-bedder. That's the going rate, even after the real estate correction most recently. So Gillen and Gibson, in writing in the pre-COVID period of 2018, talk about aspiring homeowners split between attachment to home as fleshy bodies with an ongoing need for shelter and comfort, and anxious financial subjects who are compelled to see their house as an investment and an assurance. For Julia, there remains an investment in the Australian dream as an image of the good life, even when it's becoming clear that this dream is starting to come apart. And as Berlant puts out, it is both awkward and threatening to detach from this dream, even if there are other alternatives in sight. And it's in this context, I think, that we can begin to put interventions like the Resilient Sydney Plan, conceived of with support from the Rockefeller Foundation in 2018, as a kind of fantasy response to the realities of climate change. So this plan calls for an increase in urban canopy by 40% by 2030. And there's a campaign underway right now to do massive urban reforestation, as well as the development of a distributed renewable electricity grid to power indoor air conditioning. The scope of this plan, its emphasis on trees, now recast as green infrastructure, is reminiscent of the Cumberland Plan. Returning to Berlant's proposition, what we can see in this plan is the formation that attempts to retain or project sovereign control, an effort to manage the climate at the scale of the city, and ultimately an effort to conserve the form of low-density urbanism defined by life indoors in private homes, albeit with renewably powered air conditioning made more efficient by canopy cover. It's an effort to avoid inconvenience, the inconvenience of other people, and an increasingly restive climate. Subsequent discussions in Western Sydney, in the Western Sydney region of councils, have raised issues around the inequitable access to cooler indoor environments, while others have wondered about the crucial question of who will care for this green infrastructure in its early years and what trees to plant today for tomorrow's climate. There is as well a growing recognition that humans, pets, animals, and plants are differentially vulnerable to the heat and other forms of climate disruption. What the color bar on the right-hand side here indicates. The tenor of this conversation is in no small part the effective initiatives like the Sweltering Cities Project in the Sydney Alliance. This recognition of difference interrupts the ideal form of climate management as a kind of smooth, easy-bake proposition, but equally significant interrupts the coherence of this sovereign imaginary. This creeping in of inconvenience, then, is an opening, an opportunity for negotiating what a non-sovereign response to climate chaos might look like and what forms of life and economy might eventuate. Psychoanalytic theory helps us to formalize this process, and taking some liberties here, I'd like to position the Resilient Sydney plan in the context of group therapy. And here I draw an Argentine analyst, Marciaro Giraldo's reflections on the dynamics of group therapy and his use of the L schema that describes the relationship between imaginary subject and others. What Giraldo and his colleagues describe as the dynamic tension between dialogues in the group and dialogues of the group. The group dynamic, he writes, is largely preoccupied with the line of interaction running from the bottom left to the top right, an imaginary identification, what he calls a dialogue in the group. The dialogue in the group helps to secure and resecure group identity in relation to an idealized other. It secures group coherence, and in the case of Resilient Sydney, it's that sort of feeling of, phew, technocratic innovation will solve our problems and we'll continue on with our way of life and form of comfort in our homes. Jevons paradox be damned, and earth mineral extraction ignored, and the pain and suffering of others minimized, right? So just sort of the idea that we can just keep going on as we have. For Giraldo, the analyst's job is to listen to the dialogue in the group in order to amplify moments the dialogue of the group is spoken in a language all of its own. The interruptions, jokes, and hesitations, these things unsettle and attenuate imaginary coherence. In these settings, they mark an end of analysis, a moment of disidentification with the ego ideal, a possibility of leaving the group and coming into a new and different relationship with desire. And these moments, I would argue, are already there in relation to the Resilient Sydney strategy. The demand for a more inclusive approach to climate adaptation, witness the success of the Sweltering Cities project, is an interruption, the imposition of an inconvenience that takes the shine off of a palliative fantasy that Sydney can adapt and can change without really changing. To amplify the dialogue of the group allows for a particular form of forgetting, specifically a forgetting of rote responses, the retreat into sovereignty, the magical thinking about that technology or economic growth is going to solve our problems, and a tentative step outside to some other form of response, some other way of being with one another and living in response to the heat. A forgetting that is tied to the development of a new repertoire of being. The loss of a story, the loss of coherence, is then the precondition for learning, coming to desire, and coming to embody other ways of being in the world and with one another. This talk has afforded me an opportunity to reflect on what's been explored in the Cooling the Commons project over the last few years, an academic joint venture, a collaboration, or dare I say it, a moment of academic communism. Historically, we've tended to represent the Cool Commons as an antidote to more technically oriented approaches to thinking about climate adaptation in urban contexts, but maybe a better way of understanding it is that being together should be the focus when we're thinking about what it means to be both climate ready both socially and technically. This repositioning of psyche as an indissociable from infrastructure provides a new way of understanding the relationship between the social and the technical. So what we're interested in are strategies for dealing with the hotter world that brings us outside and in relation to one another, and not just shut inside, though indoor environments are also a focus. With really consistent and persistent encouragement from our colleagues in design, this involves noticing not just isolated knowledges, practices, and spaces that promise cool respite, but rather patterns of interaction between them, the affordances of nighttime space, but also the need for different conversations around safety, noise, interaction, and even etiquette. It points to the possibilities for repurposing space, the appropriation of space built for cars, for people that could be enrolled into patterns of commoning that bring the cool, but equally important, that invite us into inconvenience. And I say inconvenience here rather than being in community, because I think this response to climate change, a pursuit of sociable cool, means initially subjecting ourselves to the pressure of being in relation, of figuring out how to do this in practice. One of the ideas that seems to have gained traction in a policy setting is the need to appropriate public space as cooling refuges during heat waves, particularly for older or more vulnerable residents. So here's West Rock talking about it, and what they emphasize is it has to be more than malls or commercial spaces where people feel pressured to spend money. So in a conversation with Andrew Hewson, the sustainability officer for Western Sydney's Penrith Council, the world's hottest suburb, showcased some forward thinking about council building design, featured in the Jordan Springs Community Center, staffed by community volunteers 7 days a week. So this is a new suburb. This is a fairly new building. So the building features allow for cool and ventilated spaces, including geothermal air exchange, which reduces the need for air conditioning, sliding glass walls. This wall is entirely movable, hidden from the direct rays of the sun, and universal design fixtures. So this meeting hall is indeed widely accessible for community use and is featured as a regular meeting site, as these signs indicate on the right here. But as Andrew's pointed out, this means it's actually worked too well. The space is booked out 6 to 8 months in advance, and it's not really flexible enough to accommodate the needs for a cooling refuge during a heat emergency. There are also questions of the duty of care, how to transport older or vulnerable residents to and from the site, what they'll do all day, and all of this needs to be ironed out. But there's an element of necessity here in terms of how this space is going to be used in the future, particularly when we head back into El Nino again. Neighboring Blacktown Council has reached out to Sydney's diverse faith communities in relation to this challenge. The advantage here is that these buildings tend to be vacant for much of the time and are frequently structured in ways that allow them to accommodate large groups for cooling purposes. So research partner Beck Reedy from Bidwell, which is near Mount Druitt, says that there's a willingness amongst the religious bodies to repurpose their buildings as part of a strategy for shared survival. This still comes with questions about how to underwrite and ensure these forms of collective action, but this gives us a context for thinking more precisely about where the social fits into socio-technical responses to climate change. I think as well this speaks to a broader point about the need to include the people, the pressures, the affections that flow between us as we're imagining what it takes to live in a warmer world. And I'm winding up here. Towards the conclusion of Cruel Optimism, Berlant points to Gibson Graham as illustrating another way of being, another one that operates outside of the genre of life of cruel optimism, and that reminds me very much of what Priscilla was talking about last week when she ended in talking about the favelas in City of God. So here's an extended quote from Berlant talking about Gibson Graham. They advance a kind of philosophical pragmatism that involves becoming a political subject whose solidarities and commitments are neither to ends nor to imagining the pragmatics of a consensual community, but to the embodied process of making solidarity itself. One does politics in order to be political with others, in it becoming democratic that involves sentience, focus, and a comic sense of pleasure, of coming together once again. Achieving and succeeding are not measures for assessing whether or not the desire to be political, that is to say, the desire to be together, was ridiculous. So comedy and laughter may seem like an odd and perhaps even risky place to conclude a talk about climate change, Sydney, and the end of the world. But when winter was unfolding down here in Australia, we were looking at the United Kingdom as they sweltered through yet another hot summer, by my count, the fourth in 4 years. And this time London hit 40 degrees centigrade. So colleague Cameron Tonkinwise found this series of tweets from people in London mobilizing their diverse cultural know-how in order to cope with the heat. So Jill Dematic was particularly prolific in their tweeting, and I'll just try and read some of these for you. 6 p.m. dinner time, and we're not eating salad because we're Filipino. we're also not cooking indoors because it's too hot for that shit. Grill a ton of Pinoy barbecue skewers, preferably with Red Horse beer. Recipe below. You're welcome. Let's see, and another one. 8 p.m. post-dinner heat wave ennui and carb sleepiness. Shake it off and get Junior to wheel out the karaoke. Sing Lionel Richie at the top of your lungs. Tipsy on too many bottles of Red Horse till 5 a.m. Wait, 11 p.m. We're in the United Kingdom. We don't like to have fun here. 10 p.m. Nighttime shower where the karaoke can continue. Unroll the bannock mat downstairs because it's too hot upstairs. Fall asleep to memories of doing this as a kid in Manila amidst the rolling blackouts with all your cousins, giggling through stories about the Manangala and other monsters. And hopefully Prior's here and can explain who the Manangala is. If these cool common strategies resemble patchworks, making do, or hacks, to use Berlant's description of the improvisational, non-millenarial commons, it's only because that's what they are. They are a being together that operates in a different register than the shiny, resilient Sydney. De Machado, in her book Hospicing Modernity, arrives at a similar conclusion about what it means to imagine that story that so many of us have told ourselves about progress, development, riches, and mobility, in short, sovereignty and control, is falling apart and indeed dying. Hospicing, attending something in the process of dying requires improvisation. It provides a means for holding on to us. And that's it. That's it.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Oh, it was amazing. What a wealth of ideas and sparks. That's just brilliant. Thank you so much. So we've got plenty of time for some discussion and some questions. I'm expecting that after, I always find this when I have conversations with Stephen, especially if we're working on something together, you just get this incredible flood of, oh my goodness, I'd never thought that. I'd never put those ideas in that way. And it's always inspiring and can take some time to digest as well. So while everyone's thinking, unless someone has a immediate question or comment, can't see any hands up yet. I do have, oh, great. Okay, over to you, Abby.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Yeah, I totally agree with Catherine about these sparks. It's quite amazing. I actually really love that figure of the group, the in the group conversation and of the group conversation, and the idea that, if I've got it right, in the group conversations have a capacity to interrupt and disturb and send us somewhere else, rather than just affirming and confirming the narratives, as in Resilient Cindy. I just wanted to ask you whether you feel that art might have a role there in that sort of interruptive kind of task.
Sorry, I held off on my coughing until now. So, yeah, so just to restate, the dialogue in the group is the one that reinforces a shared imaginary, and the dialogue of the group is the one that leads us off in other directions. So whatever, they're just prepositions. Yeah, I think art could play a powerful role in disrupting imaginary coherence. And, you know, one art exhibition, I can't remember if you went to it or if it was just me and Helen, was a group of people who are trying to develop a network of artists and individuals who care for trees in Metro Sydney. And they put on an art exhibition in Bankstown, which, for those of you who don't know, Sydney is kind of home to a Vietnamese and a Lebanese community. It's an incredibly rich space with all these massive Moreton Bay figs. And every single exhibitor was a member of this tree care group. And they did some absolutely stunning artwork about what it is to feel love for our arboreal companions. The problem is, of course, I can't put it into words, but what I do know is that was the first art exhibition that I brought my son to, and it included this block of wood that had this image of a Buddhist monk being projected onto it. So it had the effect of looking like a cartoon, and he was absolutely fascinated by it, along with everybody else that was there. So that, there was something about being in the presence of other people, like our colleague Helen, who's a landscape architect by training, who have this this different relationship with trees, well beyond ecosystem services. Sort of the commitment that seems to take expression in terms of, what does it mean to make companion planting, sort of part of a form of life in cities. Now, in that sense, I guess the Cumberland Plan is still a touch point that has multiple meanings. It can be about settling all of the basin and domesticating it, or it could be an invitation to think exactly as Rob Stokes, the current Secretary of the Environment at the state level here, said in a launch last week. Rather than having parks and cities, we should have cities and parks. So I'll remember that and hold them to it, because I think that kind of thinking, including what it means for the built form, is exactly the space that we need to push conversations about what a future Sydney should look like.
So, Stephen, sorry to take over a bit here, but I just wanted to push you on one point. So there's something about that image that you put up and the imaginary that it, in a sense, subscribes to, with the, I don't know if people remember, but that layering over this kind of city underneath. It's such a powerful image of that. But we don't have to continue the conversation about art, but what I wanted to get at was the interruptive power of art, the disruptive power, and perhaps another conversation linking that to loss. You started to talk about loss and how we can be exposed to the feeling of loss. And I recently saw some exhibition about kind of extinction studies, and artists actually, the whole point was to give the audience a sense of what is being forgotten and lost. But that's maybe something we can talk about another time. But I just found that really powerful, that idea of the group and the question of what is it that allows us to be interrupted, disturbed, inconvenienced, but
Thanks, Abby. I might take also the question or comment that Cass got her hand up, and then Stephen, you might want to respond to the interruption point and also to what Cass has to say. Over to you, Cass.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Stephen. That was so great, and so great to hear the thinking around the Cooling the Commons project and what we're going to be doing and are doing. So it was really wonderful. And I guess I'm interested to figure out how the vocabulary you've been introducing us to fits with some of the vocabulary we've been using in our action research up till now. And I mean, one thing is I'd love to hear you talk more about what sovereignty is, what it means in this context. I mean, I just don't have I have a sense of sovereignty. I looked it up. It's supreme power in a kind of an ordinary common sense way, but I just wonder how you're using that term and how it fits with whether it's master narratives or dominant discourses, or how it fits with the kind of language we've used in our action research up till now. And when you talk about that group, and the interruption, it reminded me a lot of the way we've used the kind of needs and assets discussion, where the needs discussion is a discussion that brings everybody together as victims and sometimes recognizing loss. But then the assets discussion has a disruptive aspect in terms of opening people up to possibility. Now, I mean, we've kind of had a very simplistic kind of, understanding of that and used it in opposition to the SWOT analysis. But I'm wondering whether it has any bearing on this kind of analysis, this psychoanalytic approach to it as well. So there's kind of two parts, is really how do we map on what you're talking about to things that we've talked about in a different way, and then I guess I'm interested in this new take on it and what it gives us, because I think those issues around inconvenience and things are different from what we've probably how we've talked about what we do in our action research and so on. So you don't have to answer all that now, but it just got me thinking about how do I match these things together somehow, or maybe you can help me with the bridging of these concepts. Thanks.
Yeah, I guess to answer thanks for the question, Kath. That's a good one. And to answer the second part of your question first, that was definitely the analogy that I had in mind, right? That this sort of group therapeutic process, because it's being represented at such a level of formality or abstraction, to me suggests a ready relationship with, that the kind of the convening role that an identification of deficits play initially in bringing a group together. It's the sort of language that we already talk or speak to one another when we're thinking about economic development or social change or climate adaptation. And then really the role of the researcher, much like that of the analyst, is to look for those moments where other possibilities can be injected. So I see this as a kind of generic operation, and it helps us to understand, or at least for me anyways, it helps me to make sense of what's going on there. And I guess I would go further than that and say it's not a unique property of the realm of clinical practice, that popular movements that use a group therapeutic approach, and I'm thinking here of the 300,000 groups and 30 million people who are involved in the recovery movement, use a very similar process of primary identification around the experience of addiction, and then by process of repetition and opening up to other ways of being, in this case, being in relation to other people and living life in the absence of that addiction, which is where, for me, there's that power of affirmative forgetting. Right. So for me, the kinds of things that we're trying to explore in the Cooling the Commons is about a different form of sociability, inhabiting that fully, coming to desire it, coming to think of it as a kind of shared common sense or way of being, also means, I think, letting go, abrogating, or partly giving up on the pattern of life that sort of currently gives consistency to suburban spaces like Sydney. As I was driving out to Windsor and Richmond yesterday, which is some of the flood affected suburbs, to go look at fibro hothouses that hit 50 degrees already when the western sun is setting, I drove past these new suburban developments in Marsfield that were like big 2-story McMansions, and they all had a meter of space in between one another. So, it's the city that doesn't work is still under construction. So when I think about habituated attachment to forms of urbanism that shape desires and that we literally buy into, you only need to drive out west to see it in operation in spaces that may very well be worthless in months and years to come. So I answered half your question and then got back up on my soapbox, but that's what happens. Julia, it was good to see you.
Thanks, Stephen. I might take this opportunity to ask my question, which I think follows on. And so as you were talking, I actually went and pulled up hospicing modernity, because I could feel those synergies in what you're talking about, that kind of so in that book, de Oliveira has this analogy: you've got to find your bus, right, with all the people on it who are stopping you. This isn't going to make sense for those that haven't read the book, but it's this kind of idea that you've got to learn how to give up on modernity, because modernity is not working. So how do you help modernity to die well? Well, one of this is to work on yourself. So it's very much picking up on the themes that we work with in community economies. And part of the strategy is to have your bus with everyone on your bus who are representative of the kind of habits and the habitual self-talk that you might get in that therapy sense. It's got that link to therapy where I've been sitting in on a lot of therapy sessions lately with my kids where there's this kind of talk around what are your habits of self-talk? What are those stories you keep hearing repeated in yourself? They're usually negative. That seems to be the human way. They're almost always negative. So they're almost always at that kind of needs, the problems, you know. You tend to accept that self-talk as fact. Whereas if you can say, no, that's just that story, and you name it and you start to be able to refer to it. So in those moments of despair where, you know, your self-talk is telling you, you know, as an academic that you're an imposter, you're not really up to the job, you know, you're not doing well enough, you can go, oh, hey, there's that story again. That's not a real story. That's just a story. And it gives you that opportunity, right, for distance, which is what you're talking about, the moment of analysis where you can step outside of that that self that you're caught up in. There's a lot in that, and there's a lot in, I think there's a lot of relationships in what we do in research, in action research, and in group therapy and in individual therapy. That's that kind of process written in different ways where you're kind of identifying the habitual stories that aren't doing you any good. They're not helping, and trying to find a way to step outside of those somehow and step into something different that gives you different possibilities for action and allows you to endure and work through loss at the same time. Now, my question, coming to it very slowly and trying to draw some of these threads together, is to go back to that, to Psyche, because I think I still don't get it really. So my question is, when you do that stepping outside of that kind of, I haven't got the language for it, that kind of committed habitual self, when you're stepping outside that, are you stepping into, is Psyche kind of orientation to where you might go when you're stepping outside of that mythological sovereign self that's kind of committed to these stories? Is that where Psyche is? Is it that place that you can become oriented to when you start to think about the together self, that other person, when you're distanced from your ego, when you're distanced from the subjectivity that you're habituated to reperforming? Is Psyche where we go then, where there's something different? Is Psyche where we go? Yeah, that's my question.
Thanks, Kat. And that, you know, I really appreciate a bit more of the unpacking of de Machado's book. And I just wanted to say that Heather McLean is the person who sort of introduced the book to our network, and we read a good portion of it together in CERN Sydney in the first half of the year with Anissa Madden and Bhavya and a few other people. And yeah, it was deeply affecting. So I guess, you know, what I was trying to suggest is that Psyche is a term that is sort of the summation of that, of ego formation and imaginary coherence, and then all of those currents, our relationship with the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real, with the keynotes of the real, so our embodied practice, with our relationship with law and norm, and with how we understand social coherence. Like, so there's the self, there's the subjectivity, and then Psyche is still bigger than that. In other words, it is a term of reference that describes how desire and dream and meaning are sort of written into the landscape, right? So I'm trying to use it as a term that subverts that distinction between subject and object. So so if Psyche is that more, then in a sense, the work of changing changing our urban landscape is also a reinscription of that psychic landscape as well. So I'm trying to use it as a term to elaborate a theory of change in which the subject is not left behind and isn't seen as in, like, we can either focus on subjectivity or we focus on objects and do empirical research. Like, that's a false choice. And I don't think it really describes the circumstances in which we make knowledge or perform community or advance community economy scholarship. So that was the meaning of the term. Now, in terms of Machado, when she talks about the bus, she actually at one point describes different typologies of people, including people who are more ready to change or to hospice modernity or to let go, and people who are resistant. And one thing that I find interesting in this Cooling the Commons project is that we're regularly in contact with people who manage assets for community housing. So they're oriented around thinking about material culture and building specifications and codes and laws and regulations. And we absolutely need those people on side in order to inject this sensibility of social practice in how we adjust to climate change, or to have a public conversation that shifts the standards and says that, you know, it's unacceptable that community housing groups are managing housing stock that's 60 years old and is made out of fibro. And the last gentleman I talked to, who spent half of his life homeless, says that, you know, my living room hits 73 degrees centigrade in full sun. I can't live in it. I still live outdoors. I just use this place as storage during the summer. Right. So that's the situation. We don't think of Sydney as a place that would have that kind of human experience, but it is. And I think it challenges in a way a lot of the easy ways that we generate coherence, where we imagine, oh, there's a majority world and then a minority one. Maybe not. I mean, I know this is something we all know, but it's very confronting when you see it there. You know, and this fellow was entirely ready to participate in our project and could see the value of it. You know, and he was also somebody who really loved technology. So he was a very interesting guy. Anyways, long-winded answer to a short question. Thanks for it.
Thank you. I don't think it was a ranting question, actually. Wasn't sure. Anne, you've got your hand up.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I haven't got great internet in the room I'm in. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks so much, Stephen. Very thought-provoking. And my question is a little bit still being formulated. So I've got a few threads. But the stories that you were just sharing there about people, kind of their experiences of living in this kind of heat zone, it feels like there's an immediacy to it. But I'm thinking about that difference between short-term thinking and long-term thinking. And that has been inspired by reading Roman Krznarik's book, The Good Ancestor. And I'm using this a little bit in a talk I'm giving here in California about what does it take for us to develop an acorn brain, where he talks about that person who has that capacity to think in 100-year timeframes. And so I was thinking about your Cooling the Commons project and the work that you and Kath and others are doing, and also that commoning tool where you think across generations, you know, so like in a farming context where you think across, what is it, Kath, 7 generations or something, that kind of commoning tool. So, you know, in an urban space, what would it look like? And I guess what work is already being done to think about this in terms of the trauma people feel of the immediacy of a flood or a heat wave, but the kind of planning decisions that we need to be thinking about at a collective level, and not just the planning, like the collective subject, right, that actually inhabits a city space and learns how to think in 100-year timeframes. You know, I'm refusing to live in a context where that's the norm, or what pushback do we have? And I was talking with one of Luke Drake's students this morning who's measuring micro air pollution and using devices like for individuals to learn how to monitor their own air pollution. And so we started to think about the role that the individual plays, their capacity to be what you called a socio-technical kind of subject, but at scale, like what, instead of getting in the short-term immediate mindset of, oh, the air pollution reading's bad today, I better go and spend some more time in the trees. there's got to be a way in which we become, I think, longer term acorn brain thinkers and planners. And so I guess I'm curious about what you think about that idea of kind of becoming long-term thinkers and what kind of commoning tools we could have for that. But the second part of my thought is within the CEI, we have this capacity to develop these incredible visual methodologies, you know, ABCD work and all the other things we've done that are really like the mapping work that, you know, Kevin, I'm not sure if you're still here, but yes, Kevin, you are. So, you know, there's incredible capacity to then develop visual tools and methodologies and maps that actually communicate to people that they can actually have agency with a long-term acorn brain mindset. So it's a long-winded question, but I guess I'm just thinking about the capacity we have to intervene here. So thanks so much for inspiring that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I also just want to thank Anna for dropping into the chat Castoriadis's definition of the psyche that, as she points out, kind of aligns in broad strokes with what I'm saying. And, you know, given that there's an actual trained analyst in the room too, I'm feeling a bit nervous about my somewhat rusty invocations of the psychoanalytic tradition. You know, I see it as a kind of pragmatic description of what it is to think in a group, including in a research context, both, as you said, about the immediate realities of living with the heat. And it's even hard to remember that, given that we've had 3 years of living like we're in London. And for the people out in Richmond, you know, some of my friends I've met in this project who grew up in social housing and have bought their social housing, it has meant moving in and out of their flood affected homes 4 times and marshaling their kind of economy of mutual aid and having their friends say, look, I can't do this anymore. I can't move you out. If the 100-year floods are happening every couple of years, you know, we're going to need to solve this problem at a different scale. So there's the temporal question, and then there's the scale question. So for those of you who don't know, the northern part of New South Wales has been terribly flood affected. And one of our research projects partners from the last project on manufacturing, Norco Dairy, was inundated with a 14-meter river swell that destroyed their 125-year-old ice cream factory. You know, and they're talking about moving that entire town of 50,000 people. And that's not the first time it's happened in Australia, but it may have to happen more often. And I think this kind of idea then about how do we share property or reconfigure urban spaces or reinvent them on different timescales becomes a very live question, a very different one, and a super duper expensive one. So they got a $35 million grant from the federal government to rebuild their factory. They're going to do it. And they're going to capitalize another 70 million. That's their plan anyways. This is a co-op of 300 dairy farmers that have been working for the 125 years, you know, but on some level, I question the wisdom of imagining that community is somehow just going to continue as it was and just move all the factory equipment up 7 meters high or whatever they're planning for. So yeah, there's absolutely a need to think in a longer time scale, and I think that is inevitably a reorientation of desire and investment. So right now, I think lots of Sydneysiders are quite comfortable thinking in 2 generations' time, which is that you save money and gift your child $100,000 to buy a 3-bedder for $1 million, thinking that, well, you know, property values are never going to go down. Well, they might if 10% of the properties are uninsurable and it becomes a stranded asset. So, you know, there's a way in which this question of thinking longer term has practical consequences for people who want to call Sydney home. So then I guess the question becomes, how do you attune people to this longer time scale? So I know one resource that our colleague who's here, Abby, finds quite inspiring is the Long Now Foundation. And if I'm not mistaken, they're out in California. I don't know if that's where you are at the moment or just zooming into a talk there, but that's exciting. they're another group using art interventions that try and habituate people to thinking in relation to different senses of temporality. Yeah.
Okay, I can see a couple of hands popping up. I might go to Christy first and then Jenny.
Yeah, hi. Thanks so much, Stephen, for the presentation. I'm just reflecting on the work we're doing in Psychology for a Safe Climate. You know, we've been working with groups for 10 years and specifically in the last 5 years. And one of the main areas of work is looking at the experience or the climate journey of the researchers themselves and the people doing the work, as people also often with lived experience of extreme weather events or living in cities with heat or other, you know, like it's just all of us are part of having a lived experience of the world right now. So just interested in how that's being looked at within the research, within these cooling spaces.
Well, yeah, thank you very much for your question. And it sounds like perhaps we should talk at some other occasion. I think in some level, I don't know, let me put it this way, which is yesterday or 2 days ago, I did a meet and greet with 3 people living in community housing. And I came with their sort of community activation representative from a group called Link Wentworth, which manages something like 7,000 properties in Western Sydney. And so I went and talked to that fella who was an Aboriginal man living in the fibro house, and then I talked to 2 basically, well, not just grannies, great grandmothers, who were living in brick houses that are absolute hot boxes because of their orientation, because of the lack of airflow. And so this wasn't a formal research activity yet, but it was getting to know them. And so what I found was that I learned from the second woman, Lynn, that she's related by marriage to the Samoan and Tongan community that lives in Mount Druitt, and has personally met the entire front line of the NRL championship team, the Penrith Panthers. So much of like talking about climate change is also that process of making kin, right? So I think there's a way in which this process inevitably involves that moment of imaginary identification. This was a person who said, you know, even though I'm living in social housing, I can't do without air conditioning. But that a lot of that had to do with her caring commitments, including caring for her husband of 50 years who has since passed away of Parkinson's. So my suspicion is that, you know, whether or not the psychic becomes a part of the research strategy, it inevitably intends the social relationships that are part of the research process. So when we wrote the linkage grant, we didn't include any of that talk or frame of reference. It's really structured around the concept of the commons and transition design. And so for me, I guess that's why I'm so invested in this idea that when you're thinking in those terms, you are also thinking about that sociality and inconvenience, people's desires, fears, expectations, and anxieties. So yeah, I suppose the honest answer is I'm not really brave enough to say this needs to be a part of the research process. But it is anyways. So that's the unsatisfying answer. And yeah, perhaps we can correspond and exchange references. I'd be quite keen to hear about how you all are doing it.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen.
I mean, and the other thing I would say just quickly in passing is Sarah J. Ray and the climate education. There's a global network of climate educators who've developed an existential toolkit, and you probably know them. They gave a workshop in Hawaii based on Joanna Macy's work on hope and climate change. And it was all about, at least initially, really surfacing and nominating that experience of loss. And so it was again, a group therapeutic context. And that was the first time I got to say out loud to strangers what it felt like to live through the 2019 bushfire. And I had feelings that I didn't know I had. And a lot of it was because what I could remember was walking my then 7-month-old son in the pram while wearing a respirator. And it's been seared into my mind. I don't want that to come back.
A lot of the
But it will.
Emotional methodologies, like the work that Reconnects work and Good Grief Network. There's so many of these emotional methodologies that are used, for communities. But it's really what we're seeing is really it's the researchers and the people holding these spaces are often victims. Like sometimes we've got people coming from the front line of fire or flood, and then having to hold space for community, and then obviously they're a victim themselves of extreme weather event. So that's kind of looking at the psyche in that space of how it enters in. But it's a great conversation, and I really appreciate the presentation today. And
good. I'm glad you liked it. Another thing that makes me think of is our fabulous colleague and team member on the Cooling the Commons project, Louise Crabtree Hayes, who is also doing a project on this town Lithgow, which is on the other side of the Blue Mountains, so outside of the Sydney Basin, former coal mining town. They're about to lose 400 mining jobs. So there's that trauma. There's the trauma of the Wiradjuri Nation, which is the largest landholding nation in New South Wales. And there's this idea of transition and transformation. That concept transition was something that was politically a third rail, couldn't even be spoken because people were so invested, much like Kath and Julia and Jenny had documented ages ago in Latrobe Valley. But now people are ready to talk about it, and they're ready to talk about also being affected by the fires. But even when you're ready to have that conversation, as you say, change implies loss. And so that's the context where they're trying to imagine, well, what would a shared future of Lithgow look like that doesn't revolve extractive industries or the alternative that's been there, which is light arms manufacturing. So how can we move beyond tearing things out of the ground or making guns?
And we're very lucky to have, Glenn Albrecht, coining the term solastalgia and all his work that was, if you talk to Glenn, it was 19 years ago that he coined this term solastalgia after the research in, the largest open cut coal mines and looking at communities and how they were being impacted, mental health impacts of having the landscape move away from them. So that's another sort of emergent area of these terminologies.
Yeah.
But also being used in cases of law at the moment. So
yeah, well, that's right. The other side of it is the Blue Mountains Council itself is trying to incorporate the planetary health concept into its framing and saying everything that we do has to benefit the planet, so that. And that is a discourse that I know is informed by that solastalgia concept. So there is, that's just right next door to Lithgow, where they're having difficult conversations about transition. So I think it is a right time for it. Yes.
I want to cut across this wonderful conversation because there's 3 other hands up and we've only got about 10 minutes left. So Jenny, Anna and Yaya, did one of you have a sort of direct follow-up question? If not, I'll go in order of the hand up. Jenny.
So, yes, so I actually think that Stephen might have answered the question in that wonderful discussion with Christy, because I was sort of just in my very clumsy way and half a dozen steps behind Stephen and trying to connect the dots, thinking about what this might mean, a bit like your question earlier on, Kat, about how you know, how you might in a very instrumental way operationalize this in, you know, a research practice. But, you know, I think Stephen's answered that in some ways in the discussion with Christy. But it does also remind me that Ellen's here, Ellen Russell from Waterloo, and she's got a session in about 48 hours time that is about, I mean, I think it really relates to this discussion, Ellen, because you're interested in sort of persuasion and argumentation with people who, you know, may or may not be ready for some of the conversations. So I think there are maybe things from today with Stephen that we could pick up in your session. So I'm happy just to leave it there, and for Anna and Yaya to, yeah, have some
Great,
space.
thanks, Jenny. So Anna, you had your hand up first, and then Yaya. So maybe I'll get you both to speak, and let Stephen respond in one hit as the last word.
First of all, thank you, Stephen. It's great to hear you talk always, and you helped me conceptualize more than one thing. So I'm going to choose just one for this moment, this sharing moment. One of the things I was prompted to think about was what I put in the chat about Castoriadis' work, but in relationship to what Abby said before about the disruptive power of art, and linking that with the disruption that imagination may have for all of us, and sort of restating the power of imagination. And linked to that, I also would like to bring up the notion of trauma that you've been also referring to. In this case, you've been talking about this time we're living in of hazard and extreme difficulties. And I'd also like to link that with other developments that have occurred in history in different places. For example, there's the work of Spanish Catalan psychoanalyst Francesc Tosquells, whose name I can spell in the chat later on. But I bring this up because his work was during the Spanish Republic, and his work was at the frontier, and what he was doing as a physician, psychoanalyst, and doctor was to put together a way of resisting conservative forces at the time and imagining different ways of being together at that point in Spain. Unfortunately, of course, that project was destroyed, and he had to flee to France, where he worked with other French psychoanalysts, and they put together a framework that is much related to what you brought up with group work. And so I think that genealogy, in a way, would be interesting to talk about at some point whenever we have the time, but I think it really fits very well with community economies thinking and framework. On the other hand, I also think, at least from my experience, that it's very important that when we, or if we want to step into understanding these issues, and we are opening up for the cura, the cure of traumatic situations, and so on and so forth, we need to also be careful and be prepared for things that are extremely difficult. So I guess my comment is more on how to bring those frameworks together, how to work in research that allows for this unconscious force to be acknowledged and part of the work we do. At the same time, what are the tools and relationships we need to build to make that happen in a safe way? And in finishing up, I'd also like to point out the work that many Brazilian psychoanalysts and community social psychologists have done in what they have called La Clínica del Testimonio, Clínica do Testemunho, which is a framework thought for reparation of state terrorist violence on people. So that is, I think, an interesting line also that could feed some of the thoughts you put out together today. So I'll be happy to follow on all this. And I just wanted to thank you again for your talk. Gracias.
Shall we collect the 2 questions?
Yeah, so thank you, Anna. And yeah, what would you like to contribute?
I'll tell my, Stephen, if you want to respond to these, we don't have much time. I'll tell my thoughts, and I haven't listened fully your talk anyway, so I'll
Oh,
really
well, thanks for your honesty, buddy. Yeah, look, Anna, you said quite a bit. And yeah, I think I have a great admiration for Luis in terms of using this idea of a trauma-informed therapeutic approach to thinking about transition and Lithgow. I think you're right that there's a kind of requisite sensitivity that's required in doing this research. And my guess is if this new project that we're undertaking with social housing partners around cooling and climate change adaptation is anything like the previous work, feelings can and will come up. So yeah, I think there's probably all kinds of genealogies that you have turned me onto in the past that give me heart in terms of thinking about a more political incarnation of the analytic and therapeutic process. Just for noting, Berlant and their work uses Fanon as a way of thinking about what a non-sovereign politics looks like, particularly in the context of anti-colonial struggle. So that might be another thread of connection that would be worth some exploration. But you know, I really like this idea of taking churches and religious buildings and turning them into cooling refuges, and it's sort of taking something that has a kind of sacred symbolic connotation and putting it into circulation for other purposes. So it sort of reminds me of what Agamben describes as the process of profanation, and it's linked to the commons concept as a form of life. Anyways, I think this question and answer period has given me a lot to think about and a bit to answer for. So I thank you all.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that's a wonderful point to draw things to a close. I can still see there's thoughts flipping into the chat. So clearly this is a conversation that has a lot of ongoing energy behind it. So I think this has just been a starting point. Thank you so much, Stephen, for this really rich talk that sparked a lot, I think, for everyone here. And thank you everyone for contributing your thoughts and questions. And look forward to keeping some of these conversations going. It sounds like we have an opportunity to revisit some of this tomorrow in Alan's session. Yeah, thanks everyone.